There's no good answer of what needs to happen in school. I will tell you that.
There really isn't. But
everybody wants everything.
No, I think that there is, and you touched on it a little bit, and I think that we've talked about it in the past. There's so many things that could be taught that in a way you would never get out of school.
Yeah. Well, and that's how I view it still. It's like you're always learning.
Welcome to the Archispeak podcast, the podcast for architects by architects, where we discuss all things about architecture. I'm Neil Pan. Each episode, Evan Troxel, Cormac Phelan, and me invite you in on the conversation as we talk about everything in the profession, both the good and the bad. Maybe you're considering a career in architecture, you're still in school, or you've been around the block more times than you'd like to admit. Join us in the studio as we gather around the water cooler and talk about this profession we call architecture. It's time for some Archispeak.
I died in South Africa, only outlined my body in Tiffany blue. When I died, I drove riding and swam with the dolphins and Lisa Frank.
Welcome to episode 43 of the Archispeak podcast. I'm Neil Pan.
I'm Evan Troxel.
And I'm Cormac Phelan.
And to start us off this week, we've got a couple of friends of the show. First one being Brent Olbury from Houston, Texas. And we had a little convergence on Twitter between Brent's sport Twitter world and his architecture Twitter world this weekend as the Texas team was playing the
Houston Texans.
Houston Texans. Ah, man, I blew it. Sorry.
Come on, you should know because they beat your team.
The game was so horrible, I've forgotten it already. So
blocked it.
I have completely blocked it out. Yes, the Houston Texans played my Oakland Raiders, and my team didn't show up. So anyway, he gave us a donation. Yeah, exactly. Of $30.14, which ended up being the score of the game, 30-14. So,
who had the 30?
Yeah. Do we really have to keep going on this? No. Let's just, it wasn't my team. Let's put it that way. And if you follow me on Twitter, you'd know that.
So you didn't get to use that macro that you set, that keyboard shortcut?
No.
Not too much?
No. Because by the time the Raiders scored a touchdown, it was irrelevant. It wasn't anything to be proud of. Let's put it that way. So anyway, but thank you very much, Brett. Really appreciate it. And, I think you're going to lose a lot of money if you give us donations based upon the scores of Raider games this year.
I like this.
So keep donating. We appreciate it. And our second donation this episode is from Terry Moore, and she is from Los Angeles, California. And so we appreciate Terry's donation. And keep listening, guys. And Evan, you usually do this. So what's the next part?
Archispeakpodcast.com/donate.
That's right.
Where you can also become a friend of the show by donating $5 or more, and we will read your name on the podcast, and you will get our sincerest thanks. All of the money that is donated goes toward running and producing the show. So all the website and, there's tons of stuff that we have to do to actually make a podcast, believe it or not. There's not an easy button like there is in Revit. So,
yes.
Thanks again, everybody, for donating this week. And if anybody else wants to donate, go to that website address and do it. Thank you.
You mean we don't get paid for doing this?
I've yet to see a paycheck.
Yeah, me neither. Oh, damn. All right, so this week, or I should say for this episode, Cormac wanted to talk about value engineering. He's got a couple of good stories he wants to relate, and
I think it was a
commiserating.
Yeah, it was a mutual between Evan and I, who pretty much shared a similar day of value engineering. sometimes value
So this
hatching,
is where
whatever.
This is where we insert the, womp, womp, womp music or something.
Very sad.
Very sad music. So, all right. So, Cormac, what happened?
What always happens.
What always happens is, well, this is an interesting special case because, there's times when most people spend a project, especially, and Evan and I can talk pretty, frankly about all this stuff, is when you're doing public schools and stuff, you automatically know that they have a tight to almost non-existent budget sometimes, and you're always looking throughout the design process, the construction documentation, to basically streamline the design. It doesn't mean sacrifice the design, but at least streamline the design to, essentially value engineer while you're designing to make sure that you can get something that both you're proud of and that will come in under budget so that they'll actually fund the project. I just happen to have one right now that they're constantly changing the budget on us. So it's not one of those value engineering by choice. It's a value engineering or the project doesn't exist, because first it started off with one number, then they cut it by 5%, which is a big amount. And then, which equated to about $5 million. And then they cut a few more millions of dollars. And for anybody who's out there listening who knows that if you're doing a school, $2 million is a lot of money. $5 million is a hell of a lot of money. And now it's $7 million. That's like half of a building sometimes. Or, a lot of additions or selective renovations and things like that.
Yeah. Depends where you are in the country.
Yeah, yeah.
Like for me, that's 2 or 3 buildings on my site.
And because of this, it's really an interesting project because it's broken up into 3 funding. They've got 3 pots of money that the funding's coming from. One was for basically an exterior upgrade. Then the biggest pot of money was for systemics, which is mostly HVAC and life safety stuff. Like, because it's not a sprinkled building, it'll now be a sprinkled building. And so then there's a smaller budget, and that's more like selective renovations, asbestos abatement, there's all the little things that really aren't going to be seen, but they're going to improve the building. Well, the exterior package already bid. The mechanical package, apparently we can't touch. So where does it all come from? Any and all of our educational upgrade, enhancements to the building, any and all of our selected renovations or additions that would improve either circulation or security and safety and all this other stuff. So, here we are having this meeting where, on a typical value engineering, you bring the scalpel and you do these nice little incisions to cut a little bit here and a little bit there. And here I am pulling out the hatchet.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of times the wrong approach is to do the little tiny cuts, because you end up taking away things that don't add up to enough to make a difference.
Yeah.
And because you do get there's a big economy of scale happening on these projects where you're purchasing something and you're almost not even paying for it, so you're cutting a little bit more glazing out, but you got to replace it with wall anyway, so you're not getting a dollar for dollar reduction. Yeah. And so, somebody's trying to go around and nip and tuck little pieces of glass here and there when really in the big picture, like, you have to lose a building. Like you said, you have to pull out the hatchet to actually make it work.
Yes, which was there went my new front entrance, there went this, there went that,
And then you've got to be the one who says this is what we have to do, and you just watch your client's face melt off.
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
Because they don't want to cut anything. They don't want to. They've already thought that they're going to get all that.
Yeah. What's worse is then we, through the higher ups, not the actual school itself, but the higher ups, but they've made this decision for us to go ahead and remove X amount of dollars from the project. So you go through and you do all of your assessments of exactly what you're going to be able to eliminate or modify to get to basically equate to that maximum dollar figure. And then once you're done with all of that, then you get to go back to the school itself, the administrators, the principals, and teachers, and re-present to them. Remember everything that we presented before? Yeah, I was just kidding. Here's what you're really getting. And then it's nothing in comparison. And that's actually the thing that really, I don't know, and everybody experiences it. The thing that sucks the worst about the value engineering process when it's not anything that was, through excessive design or anything like that. It was just, ultimately, because other projects, and here was the case, is other projects within the school system came in over budget, and to fund those, they robbed, other projects that had funding that was coming later in the year to get those up off the ground. Well, guess what? Those projects, two of them being ours, just so happen to, not get any payback. It's just, okay, here's your new budget, make it work. You're like,
yeah.
And then of course it's always the, well, this is going to cost because now we have to do an additional services for, all of these, change in scope and stuff. And where does that come out of? The same budget that you're already cutting.
Yeah.
So now you feel horrible because not only do you have to cut all of this project out because the project didn't have the budget to support the program that you were designing, but now you are charging them to, which you have to really, because if I'm not going to ask my mechanical, my MEP engineers to redesign these entire systems for free when it wasn't, because of them or, anything that they did. It was a owner request. So now you say, okay, we'll give you a fee, be, as tight as you possibly can. You beat them down a little bit on the fee. But then when you add all that fee up, that's more that you have to cut out of the building because you still have to take that fee out of your building project as well.
Sounds like a pretty vicious cycle.
Oh, it is. It's absolutely, it's so, and I am trying to be, pretty vague about it because I don't really, I don't want to divulge too much information about it, but
okay.
But it just seems like everybody's had this issue.
Well, let me ask a question because I have a slightly different take on value engineering, but in your guys' worlds that you work in, mainly doing schools and other public buildings, is value engineering always like our budget's been cut and so you cut it? Is it cutting things out of the project? Is that typically what you guys encounter for what you're describing as value engineering?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean the budget's necessarily been cut, but but the environment's changed, or in the case on my project, there's a lot of unforeseen site conditions that all of a sudden are costing a lot more money than ever expected. And then just looking at the future bidding environment and the way that the market's picking up and trying to have some contingencies in there, and all that stuff adds up. And so what does that mean? It means you start cutting back now, and then what's crazy is we keep cutting back and the budget or the price keeps going up. because of all that stuff. So then you just have to keep doing it over and over. And really, it's pretty depressing process to go through. I know that the morale definitely drops
absolutely.
on the project at that point. And I think one of the reasons that it's good to talk about this is because this doesn't happen in school. And for all of our student listeners who are tuning into this, I mean, this is a reality that we see on practically every project, and this is not something that is ever really talked about on Arc Daily or Architectural Record, or so either the blogs or the magazines. This isn't really something that people talk about because, number one, we don't like to talk about it. We don't like it when it happens. But the realities of having to cut huge pieces out of your project that you have spent time on,
Months,
blood, sweat, and tears on creating and making and planning and detailing, and when it goes away, man, it does hurt. And I think that it's kind of one of those things that people don't like to talk about, but it's something that we should be talking about. And when our clients go through it and they get just as depressed as we do, I mean, so it hurts everybody. But a budget is a budget, and I think one of the things that when it comes to design work, for some reason there's some kind of stigma, I think, with a lot of clients where they don't want to tell you what their budget is, and that just makes it worse, right? Because then you kind of just run with design concepts and ideas, and they love it, and then at the end they're like, what? I didn't know it was going to cost that much. And well, how much did you think it was going to cost? So I think that it can definitely lead to problems and fighting and distrust and all kinds of things like that. So there's a lot of meat in the whole value engineering subject that comes back to money.
Well,
then the lawyers get called, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
potentially.
Here's the thing is that, there's the market's actually getting a little bit stronger. So where you had at one point in time any and every contractor, and I remember a couple of projects where contractors would basically bid the project out at almost zero profit to land the project. And, they're obviously getting paid through, material and labor costs and stuff like that, but they were essentially taking, almost zero profit. Well, those days are gone. And
they were trying to make it up in change orders sometimes.
And yes, they do that too. And I, that's for a completely different podcast where we can get into the whole how change orders can kill you.
We'll add it to the list.
Yeah, but so there's so many different things that are actually changing and affect the budget itself, because a lot of times in the school budgets and stuff, the Board of Ed will have the project won't move forward without funding. So they already know what their budget is. And they built in, soft cost. They do build in some unforeseens a lot of times, even on this project that I just finally finished up after 5 years. There was a lot that we built into it for unforeseens because it was a couple of historic buildings. It didn't actually amount to the amount that we finally ended up having to pay for unforeseens because, we were, having to pay for archaeologists, which, nobody ever thought of that. We had them come out 5 different times to do surveys and stop the project. So you get hit with delay claims. They don't really foresee that. Come to find out that the buildings didn't have foundations. Didn't really know that.
So Cormac, let me ask a dumb question. You said something. You said we didn't think about that. Not necessarily we didn't know, but I mean there's the foundation thing. Okay, you didn't know about that. That's impossible to know or even anticipate, right?
Well,
but the archaeologist part, it's like, oh, we didn't think about that. Do you get in trouble, or is a firm opening itself up to any sort of liability at that point when, oh, well, why didn't you think of that, Mr. Architect? You've done these projects before.
Well, because
you're supposed to know everything.
Well, because here's actually, let me address that particular project in general. So we did actually do a, geotechnical survey of the building We did test pitting all around the building to determine foundations and all that other stuff as it related to our addition.
Right.
So anything within the footprint of our addition, we knew what we were getting into. We even had archaeological surveys of all of those areas.
Okay.
The problem is that when we started to get into it, we did a test pit, say you had, in this particular case, 170 linear foot length of wall. And you can't do a test pit the full length of the wall. You just get a snapshot of what you're assuming the foundation of that particular wall is through, a few selective test pits. You do the test pit, you come up with your footing depth, and you go from there. Well, these were a fun little condition where the only place
You picked exactly the wrong place.
The only place that we actually had a foundation was at the test pit, 5 feet to the left and 5 feet to the right. That was it. The rest of the building, all the way around, was basically a thickened solid masonry wall sitting directly on the soil.
Wow.
The wall extended 12 inches beyond the finished floor. That was it. There was so we did pre-plan, X amount of dollars to go to unforeseen conditions. But
right.
When you're assuming that when you thought you did your due diligence,
right,
and it says, hey, you have foundations here, and then you go a little bit further because you're going to basically be affecting that entire length of wall and find out that the rest of it didn't, you have to stop, re-engineer it.
Sure,
in our particular case, we came in and we underpinned the entire length of the wall. I think it was probably like 4 foot wide of cast in place concrete, and somewhere around about 11 feet deep. So that's a lot of concrete.
Right.
That's a lot of work.
In other words, you kind of did do your due diligence.
We did
have people come out,
but we were caught off guard because you got a 118-year-old building with absolutely no real documentation.
Sure.
And it's an occupied school. The school board let us do very little. They wanted us to do, the preliminary surveys on the cheap.
Right. Well, of course.
And so that kind of forced our hand to say, well, we really need this, 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 and this. And they're like, well, we're not going to pay for this, 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 and this. So if you want it, you're going to have to do it for free, which in a lot of cases we did. And the reason we did was because we wanted to have some assurance that what we were designing was going to continue to stand.
Right. Well, let me give you guys a slightly different take on value engineering. Most of my career did a lot of production housing here in California, and when we did value engineering meetings, they were oftentimes more coordination type meetings, and that's why I asked the question a little bit earlier about what is typically what you find in your value engineering, because for our part, when we're doing, production housing, you would get the architect, the structural engineer, hopefully the mechanical contractor, and a number of the other, not vendors, but subcontractors that are involved in the project. And everybody had like the preliminary set of plans. Here's what how we think it's going to get framed. Here's the architecture and, just pretty much everything. And then all of the like contractors and subcontractors all come into the room, and we beat the project up. So in a way that, basically, it's like, well, if you move this window over here, I can eliminate the shear wall, or, and, oh, well, I need a soffit here. Well, maybe not a soffit. Let's do this. And so everybody kind of coordinates. So they were more like coordination type meetings. That being said, there would oftentimes, the owner or the the developers in the room as well, and they would sometimes, okay, let's cut that. We don't need those. We don't need that many lights in that room or something like that, or that brick that you have returning around the wall here. Yeah, we don't need that. Just cut it off here. And so that would certainly happen, and that speaks kind of to what we're, the value engineering being a dirty word. It's like we're going to cut this, save $50 on this house. And that used to frustrate me, especially when I first started doing the production housing stuff, is that I was like, wow, come on, it only cost you $50 or $100 to wrap this stone or wrap this brick. I mean, that's probably an exaggeration. It's probably several $100s, but they're like, in the production world, it's like, well, if I can save several $100s and I can do it on every house and I'm building 100 of them, well, that just paid for my trip to go to Hawaii this year.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so it became frustrating, but value engineering for me was more coordination and how do we get all of the different parts and pieces, into a house or a group of houses, a number of plans or a number of different elevation styles. It was almost like we were doing BIM, if you will, with all of the parts and pieces, but we're all sitting around the table talking about it instead of modeling it, because we didn't do that 15 years ago or 10 years ago.
I think that the biggest disservice that value engineering does, or this process that we're talking about, is that the client has an expectation as far as what they're getting, and there's somebody who's trying to reduce whatever that is, and, in order to save money, which is a legitimate reason why to do it. But typically what I've seen is the person who's really trying to do that does not care about the end product according to the users who are going to be using it. So in our case, it's kids, right? It's what I've said before is our clients are our clients' clients. It's not, yes, we are building this school in this particular school district with certain administrators and people in charge, but they are not the end users. The end users are the teachers and the kids, and really it's the kids. Right. And so what we're trying to do is create the best learning environment possible. And I can tell you right now, the people who are trying to make the decisions about what to cut and why something does not deserve to exist in the project don't give a crap about those kids, or about that learning environment, I should say. Right.
Or have
and
they
that's
ever
the most frustrating part.
Yeah. Or have they ever stepped into a classroom to really see what that environment should be?
And I know that they've stepped into lots of classrooms, and maybe they just don't recognize the impact that a good learning environment can have versus a typical learning environment, because whatever they want to build, I'm sure is good enough for somebody. But that's not why I do architecture. The reason I do architecture is because I want to affect somebody's life. And if that's going to be a kid, so be it. I want it to be the best learning environment that I can with the money that they're willing to give us to make it happen. And so I'm fighting the other direction. I'm like, I'm going to find another way to get tackable surface into this project. I'm going to spend more time researching and digging and finding somebody who's going to be able to give me a product at half the cost of the thing that I had in there, but they still get it so that they can still achieve what they want in that space.
I'm glad you actually said that, because that's actually, to me, now we're talking, my example came in as this, when I started explaining my current project, it was more about, how eliminating budget is affecting the design, where we're basically having to come in with a hatchet and chop off a bunch of stuff. And, that's the kind of like horror story of value engineering. But what you just said, and I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I want to make this point pretty clear. Good value engineering, because there is good value engineering, and the value engineering that makes us all cringe and go into the corner and cry like a baby in a fetal position because we've just killed our building.
That's an interesting visual.
It's
Cormac crying in the corner.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry, I don't cry. I have no emotion.
'Cause you're a Marine.
Excuse me, Army. Thank you,
Army.
soldier.
Sorry, soldier.
Jeez,
Evan
You
cut that part
could
out.
not have said anything worse.
Worse.
I know. I mean, you could have said to cut my budget another $50 million, and I
would've
wouldn't
been
have
better.
reacted like being called a damn Marine.
Hey,
Now be
careful,
careful
to
there.
and to any Marine listeners, I mean, you got to
email Cormac.
Email Cormac. His
mean,
email address will be listed.
Even
in the show
Marines
notes.
need heroes, and that's why the Army's around. Come on. I'm kidding.
detour.
I'm kidding, of course. Anyway, but back to the good value engineering. Good value engineering is exactly what Evan was saying, and that's where throughout the process of the design, and even, into, construction, not construction, but, construction documents, if you see something that, is giving you kind of a pain in detailing, if it's going to give you a pain in detailing and there is a easier way to do it, that's usually going to end up being a cheaper way because, as I'm finding out on a project that's under construction, I had this one area that, two different new sections of a building are coming together with three different sections of an old building in kind of like this little perfect storm of just problems with multiple layers of steel beams and, different heights and things like that. So with all of that stuff coming together, I was just really petrified of how it was going to work out because the way that I was detailing it felt right, but wasn't quite sure. And thankfully, with very open dialogue between me, the construction manager, and the steel contractor, we got it all worked out before they even, cut the first beam to bring out there, So, but
This also sounds like a BIM.
yeah.
You guys were all getting this, and you're right. This is what value engineering should be about, which is experience that leads to a more efficient, a quicker, a cheaper way to do the exact same outcome,
But it's
or close to it.
Yeah, it's the it's either adding or changing elements within your design to achieve the performance, achieve the quality of design, achieve the
intent.
Achieve the intent at a more cost-effective, easier construction method to make everything go smoother and easier. And that's what good value engineering is. And I think I got a little sidetracked because of Neil's derogatory comment towards the U.S. Army. But I think it's working through the design process and thinking about all of the the right decisions. It's that best practices that we always talk about. That's good value engineering throughout the whole process. And so there is that good and evil value engineering. And I think, Neil, in a way, you were almost talking about the convergence between the good and bad, where, it wasn't necessarily, you were doing things to make it just a little bit cheaper on delivery, but it was, it wasn't things that were detrimental to the design, or maybe it wasn't.
Well, it sometimes was and sometimes wasn't. But going back to what Evan was saying earlier, the people in that room making all of this decisions rarely, if ever, had the end user in mind here. The end user in this case was the family or whomever was buying these homes. And
it's unknown, right? I mean,
well, in this case, yes, it's completely unknown. So you really can't know them. But me as the architect would always be in there thinking, I want to try and create, a beautiful and pleasing streetscape. So I want these houses to look a certain way. and or just the inside spaces to work a certain way so that it's an efficient and a good home, right? And the other people, on the engineer, he doesn't care about window placement or anything. He's just like, whatever is the best that I can save a hold down here or a shear wall there or a strong wall over here. That's all they care about. And then the client or the developer in this case is, I can save 2 shear walls or 2 strong walls if I eliminate this. Okay, yeah, do that. That's just saved me $1,000 per house times 100 houses. And so that's the way they look at it, and nobody really cares about. And so I often found that I was the only one that really cared about who was the end user, what is it going to look like. I mean, the builder does care because they want it to sell. So their mentality in this particular case is, does that affect the sellability of the house? No, then I'm going to save some money. And it's hard to argue that, right? It's like, please spend money for something that nobody is going to see or feel warm and fuzzy about other than me or other architects that may experience these homes, or just the homeowners. They won't care if, one thing is this way or it's that way, because they'll never know. Well, but I'll know.
Well, see, you just kind of explained the catch-22 that architects exist in. And that's, and we've talked about this in the past about, what value, architects bring to projects and things like that. And in this particular case, we're talking about value engineering and kind of tying it all together. Evan and Neil, you were just both talking about, how the building feels to the end user and kind of both the aesthetics and also the environment and everything else. So we, in this world we have to live in, we care about all of that, but we also have to care about the budget. We also have to care about the cost effectiveness of things, and the type of materials and the maintenance and just all of these different things. And never, and maybe I'm wrong, or but never can we ever truly reconcile all of the different cares and concerns that we always have on these projects, because something's going to give,
Yeah, I think also just the longer it drags out, the more people just want to be done with it, right?
Right.
Or somebody new comes onto the project that doesn't have those attachments, or somebody leaves the projects that had those attachments, and now someone doesn't have to deal with them.
I laugh only.
I'm curious, guys. When you guys were in school, and I can't recall personally myself, but I mean, did we ever have to deal with, budgets are tough because, until something gets bid or something, it's really hard to know the cost. So maybe this is kind of unrealistic to ask to be done in a school environment. But, I mean, did you guys ever have to deal with, kind of a budget question at all? No. In any design projects you guys worked on in school?
No, everything was designed and, theorized in a bubble outside of the realm of buildability and budget.
Yeah, I would say the answer to that for me is never. Never once.
I was just going to say, I'm curious for those student listeners that are out there. I mean, do you think... I'm asking our listeners to kind of give us some feedback on this. Do you guys think that having some of that as an experience in the classroom would be helpful, or is school the time to, like you just said, be in the bubble? We don't really care about the budget. We don't really care about, can you build it? Let's just design. Let's express ourselves. Is that the environment? Is school the best time to just do that? Because we're all going to spend the rest of our life in this prison of architecture afterwards, right?
Thanks, prison. Wow, that's ouch. No, here's how I believe this, that we want to teach, the design and, kind of having them, the design, the theory and everything else. And early on, when you're kind of letting people explore, you're You know, you've got them taking the 101 classes where they're learning, drafting or, whatever kind of tectonic thing.
What?
Whatever kind of tectonic thing that they're learning. That's a good time for them just to kind of have a little bit of freedom of design and, theory and just kind of exploring. But because these, schools are typically 5-6 years, span, you need to start reining it in because, we've all talked about this in past episodes, but the biggest complaint really is when we all came out of school, we really had the value that we brought was potential to be something later on down the road and not be able to really hit the ground running with practical skills that would, be a billable hour kind of thing.
Yeah, but I think that's what the mentoring process, once you're out in the field, is all about. It's about new, fresh ideas merged with experience and know-how, because no one expects you to come out of school and just start running projects when you go work for a firm. You just don't start running projects. And we've talked when, and let's put this again back in the comparison of, us to doctors and lawyers. They are expected to be able to come out of school and be able to save lives or practice law because they've actually put those constraints, and we've talked about that in the past too. Architecture is being able to manage a set of constraints, a set of, rules and things like that. And never in school, we're given design problems and we explore those and we basically stretch out, all of our different solutions to, every possible different variation, a variable of the solution. And that's great. And we should continue to do that. But there's got to be this layer of adding constraints to really kind of push them, because when you have basically, other than just, okay, here's your site, put, whatever you want, here's your design problem, go ahead and do it. Then if you start adding those layers of constraints on there, this is the type of material that you need to use, or here's your budget, you find the material that's going to fit that budget on this site, then they start to take that, all of this, their earlier explorations, and start to kind of focus it on real, practical, useful knowledge that they're going to be using for the rest of their career.
Well, what about, let me ask this then, would there be a value in, say, a part of a studio class, or perhaps, one studio class during the year or something like that, where they're given the task, students are given the task of, okay, we're going to design something. We'll keep it, somewhat simple. You don't have to spend the whole quarter or semester designing, but part of your design process is to have, as you said, constraints, Corvick, of maybe here's a budget. And so now, as Evan, you were saying earlier, if you want a particular material or construction detail that in your project, then you've got to find a way to, cut somewhere else or value engineer somewhere else so that you can do that. And so it's really teaching design. It's teaching the real world realities of how do I find products online. Because I think that was a real deficiency, and at least in my education, was, how do you go find these things? How do you learn about
online.
that?
There were Sweets catalogs.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I'm sorry.
Back then
There
it was
were
Sweets. Come on.
It was Sweets. I understand that, but we're talking 2014 now. So, you search online, you find these products,
Which
and you go through the process. So and that's kind of bleeding over into, what should be taught in school or how it should be taught. But I guess I'm kind of going above that and just saying, should something like that be taught in school so that we experience, these things, and we learn to not only design in school, but also design for cost effectiveness and, so that you can achieve this intent that you spoke of earlier for a more cost effective solution.
Here to me, real quick, design build studios are a great way to introduce that, that layer of constraint without really stifling their creativity, because essentially their rural studio is a great example. I get to tout my school for a little while, but rural studio is a great experience for everybody who goes out and does this, because they have real clients, they have real budgets. They spend a lot of time basically saying, okay, how can we stretch that budget? Well, a lot of how we can stretch that budget is we're going to be doing we'll be doing all of the design. We'll be doing almost all of the labor. Most of that cost will be going towards materials. So what can we do to stretch those materials under, basically free labor to get the most dynamic design that we possibly can? And so I think with the constraints, it's that it never actually throws up roadblocks. I think it actually adds a layer of creativity to it.
Yeah.
And
well, that's what design is, right? It's problem solving through constraints.
Right. And so, it's not necessarily, hey, let's have a studio project, process where we sit down and on a very static project, we give them the site, we give them this, we give them that, we throw in a budget, you throw in the construction timeline, blah, 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 and all this other stuff. And this is how you have to deal with it. And you're just dealing within a bubble of a studio environment. Getting out, swinging a hammer, looking, talking to a client, trying to scrounge up, extra material because you think that, hey, we're going to do a rammed earth wall, but to let in some light, why don't we go and get some recycled soda bottles, glass soda bottles that, are green and blue and this and that and the other. And so now you add a layer of dynamic design to it that otherwise you wouldn't have really got on a typical constrained project that you would have done in studio. And so you go and you look at a lot of the projects in the rural studio. I mean, these things are built for like $5,000. They had challenges to do the $20,000 home, which was like an actual livable home, with like maybe 3-bedroom, bath, stuff like that. Trying to get the design down or the cost of the construction down, but it never diminished the ability to stretch the design or make it more dynamic or make it something that's, above and beyond like the norm.
Yeah. I have an observation about architectural studio, at least from my experience, which is in, I know we started out with value engineering and now we've kind of merged over into education. But I feel like when students graduate and they go work for a firm, they have been operating under a severe disadvantage while in school, whereas professors, again, this is my experience, who are teaching design studio, number one, don't put you in a hourly work environment. So you and I could go either way right now with this, but honestly, projects as far as design go, it takes what it takes to accomplish.
Right.
But at the same time, we bill by the hour. So there's a big conundrum there. But in studio, that never comes up. You do what it takes to get the project done, right? And so either you're really good at managing your own time or you're not, and you spend way more time doing it. Either way, you're going to get that thing finished. And the professor is never checking on that. They just know that they're going to get a product in the end. And
Right.
again, I think that also is a disservice to most of the architecture that we do, because most of what we do is not a product. It is a process.
Right.
And constraints come from process and budget and clients and needs and all of these things, which do not exist in product-based architecture, right? There may be a few constraints, but they are not all of the ones I just mentioned for the most part. You know, you have a client and you have a program and you have a site. And those are your main constraints, but there are so many more constraints in the real world of architecture.
Right.
And so my advice is to know, number one, that you're not going to get that education in school. Know what you're not getting, unless you go to a place like Rural Studio, and I'm sure there's others. But my advice is go get a job while you're in school doing that stuff. Work construction, or work in a firm, or find somebody in your family who wants to build something and build it. Design it and build it over the summers. And that will give you the experience that we're talking about. Working with budgets, working with a city, doing the permitting process, doing the drawings, swinging a hammer, all those things, man.
Working with the client.
That is the real experience of what it actually takes to get something built. And as our friend Bob says, and I totally agree, it doesn't count if it doesn't get built. If you're going into architecture to do paper architecture, you're talking about the product, and you're not working with the constraints that we're talking about. So you've probably already turned this podcast off. But, I mean, that's my advice to students out there, and know what you're not getting, and then make that happen while you're in school on your own.
Well, you know, you say that we've deviated from our discussion about value engineering, but I don't necessarily agree, because everything that you just talked about, all of that comes back as probably the biggest aid to value engineering, or understanding how to do the good value engineering throughout the process. Because what you're doing is, you know, you've got a good working base of this practical experience where, and as you know, get more seasoned and you know, get more experience, let's throw the seasoned word out. When you gain more experience through, you know, projects, and you're going out and you're looking at construction administration, and you can see what, you know, how things are being built and stuff like that. You start to build your own personal knowledge base of what works, what doesn't work, so that you can, you know, get it, you know, be able to work through all of this stuff and get it right.
Yep.
So I think that, you know, everything that you were talking about, Evan, everything that I was talking about, Neil, we're talking about on it, all these different, you know, things that you experience could really help shape the process, make it a better value engineering process, because you're doing smart design throughout the entire process, rather than wait until the very end.
Yeah, and I just to throw this in there, I mean, when you're doing design work, I mean, you have to be thinking system-wise. You have to be thinking about structure at the same time, and mechanical at the same time, and lighting at the same time, and architecture at the same time. Because if you're not, man, when you get to that point where you got to start cutting things out or trying to fit things in that just don't work because of you didn't think of all that stuff, you're going to be screwed. It's going to be even more painful, and you are going to have to redesign it.
Yeah.
That's
so
when
the
value
smarter
engineering comes in.
The smarter that you are going through the process, the less pain you will have to go through when it actually comes time to start cutting things out.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, guys, I would like to encourage our listeners to either through Twitter or on our Facebook page, and call in to the Archispeak podcast hotline at 415-484-8496 and share with us your most either successful value engineering, or give us that horror story. It's really good to share it on the show.
I'm sure everybody out there listening has got one to share.
All right, so that's our challenge. Everybody, let us know what you think about value engineering, and thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks, guys. That was a good topic, and I know we touched on a bunch of stuff, but I felt like was a really good conversation. So thanks.
Thank you, guys.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
What you get. This is what you get. This is a schedule. This is a set. It's unpredictable as you forget. If you blow, you can bet. I know, I know, I know. This is what you get. This is a schedule. This is a set. It's unpredictable as you forget. If you blow, you can bet. I know, I know, I know. It's unpredictable as you forget. If you blow, you